Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, grasshoppers. Our new stream in 2025 is going to include the godfather of chess, India, Vishwanathan Anand, whom I've known since the early 90s. Not as early as this game, though, as basically this is the first golden game that Anand played. That is one of the best games that was voted on by a panel of judges. And it appears in the book 1000 Best of the Best Games. Basically, in each informant, 10 games were voted on. For the first 100 informants, all 10 games appear in this book in their respective chapters, sequentially, chronologically, as they appeared, relatively in date and voting order. There are only 100 games that are the best of the best, but you get to see all the games. This game was not voted the best of the best in that particular informant. Korchnoi losing to Garry Kasparov in Amsterdam 1991 was voted the best game. Now, interestingly enough, Anand's games did appear in the informant before this. They just didn't appear before the panel of judges that were voted on each cycle. And in this particular case, Anand is black. And after the move d4, you have to consider all of the options that Anand might play as a young player. Now remember, Anand is perhaps only 21 years old at the time of this game. I don't think he's 22 yet, but he's definitely 21 years old. And in order to kick this off the right way, we are going to go with candidate moves. For black. Now, the purpose of the candidate moves, interestingly enough, don't tell me more. Stream chat is not working. Let's just see if we get it. Oh, there it is. Oh. Did I not spell it right, perhaps? Candidates. Let's check before we start. So we do have candidates. And we're looking for 3 moves. We're going to match wits with Anand for the most part from the very beginning. There are 3 very popular moves in this position that black can play. The moves after the first 2 are not particularly mainstream, but I can automatically think of several that black would play in this particular position that you might want to consider. It also helps to know Anand's temperament, his style of play, and he was extremely exact and logical, Capablanca-esque, Fischer-esque in his play. Now, it's okay if you didn't really get the move, but let's just start off with a pretty instructive example here. Almost everyone knows that knight f6 and d5 are the 2 most popular moves that are played in answer to d4, and that is to control the e4 square either directly or indirectly by attacking it with the piece. We could also play the move f5, which is the Dutch defense, not the 3rd most popular option amongst most grandmasters, but e6. e6 is a very useful move if black is willing to play the French defense. The French defense is in Anand's repertoire. Also g6 if players like to play King's Indian and Grunfeld structures but want to ease their way in. They can also resort to a Leningrad Dutch immediately afterwards. Lastly, we have the moves c5, which is an anti-London. Bishop f4, c takes d4 is very uncomfortable for white. And we also have the move, lastly, the move that Anand played in this game, which was d6. Now, this is a very young Anand, and Beliavsky is a particularly aggressive player who can play either e4 or d4 at any given occasion. And he does choose to go straight into the Pirc as white, an e4 opening, challenging e4, almost requiring the move knight c3, And then Anand immediately goes into a King's Indian formation, except that without c4 being thrown in, well, as it turns out, it is called the Pirc, or Modern Defense, PIRC, and it is quite a surprising choice, in my opinion, because this opening does not lend itself to the same dynamics that a Sicilian has. A Sicilian defense gives you the option of the open c-file if black allows you to capture on d4. Therefore, if white does not put a pawn on d4, black is fully okay, if not better than okay, playing any anti-Sicilians. So therefore, in this particular instance, we're allowing white full command of the center, and Beliavsky responds with perhaps the most aggressive, well thought out move. This is a perfectly acceptable option, given that black has no pieces that can take advantage of this diagonal of disaster. The E1H4 diagonal. And Beliavsky, of course, chooses the most aggressive example. There's one other move that Anand could have particularly entertained here, but there's a forcing known draw line in that line, which both players could accidentally choose to play, depending on the circumstances in the tournament. However, he chooses to speed his development along. Now, this is the first sign of pure aggression. When I was growing up, the move bishop to d3 was the #1 choice, and it was played by Fischer in his many games throughout his career. And it's the move that I learned when I was young because of it. And as a result of black's counterplay involving c5, whether black plays knight a6 and c5, or prepares it later with moves like knight on b to d7. In this particular case, bishop to e3 tries to head that pawn break off at the pass. We can already see that e5 is being attacked 3 times, so e5 is out of the question. We don't really want to lose a pawn this early in the game. So Anand responds with the #1 choice of most players in the Pirc defense against this. Now, there's a favorite game of mine, Ilya Smirin playing black against Judith Polgar, where Judith Polgar obliterates Ilya Smirin, and that game goes something along these lines. Queen at e2, c5, castles queenside, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight c6, bishop takes f6, and after bishop takes f6, Judith Polgar commenced her attack with h4 in an almost miniature status game that was approximately about, I think it was less than 25 moves. In this particular case, Beliavsky strikes immediately with a move that is not in the top 5 choices. For example, white could easily play the move queen to d2, could easily prepare some restriction against this bishop going to g4 and actually further the option for g4. Personally, when I play this position again, I'm probably going to be playing either bishop to d3 or queen to d2. When you see me playing white in this position again at some future date, I will be playing those 2 moves. However, Beliavsky goes for the immediate center ball buster e5. And now we have to consider black's options once again. There are only 3 realistic possibilities in this position. So we're looking for 3 candidate moves for black. And by looking for 3 candidate moves for black, we're not looking for the best moves in the position, mind you. We're looking for moves that are good. So, for example, any move that is good, i.e., d takes e5, should certainly be amongst your 3 candidate moves. However, we can refrain from captures just yet in this position and play another move. Now, once you have your 3 candidate moves in this position, once you've decided upon the moves that you wish to consider, then you have to involve yourself in the process of calculation. Calculation means that our opponent's move, and then our further move, and then a possible reply to our further move, and so forth. And along each step of that tree of analysis, you're going to be considering candidate moves also in the back of your mind. Another great benefit to the choices and the potential of candidate moves is that you're going to build up a reservoir stock of several moves every time you move. Imagine for a moment, we'll use 3 as a perfect example. When you choose one of those 3 moves after calculation, you're going to have 2 good moves left over that may still be good on the following turn, the following turn after that, or the following turn after that. So at the end of several moves, having played and used the candidate moves process, you will potentially have 6 remaining good moves in the position to be able to draw upon. In this particular case, it is never good to move the same piece twice. Therefore, we're going to move our knight to either e8, d7, or g4 if we don't capture on e5. And by the way, capturing on e5 will only help white. Exchanges often help the opponent. Exchanges will, especially of pawns, open up lines. And if we're not prepared to take advantage of those open lines, whether they're diagonals, whether they are open ranks, that is, being able to lift a rook up and across, or open files, most likely being used by rooks, doubling rooks. Now, of course, when you have your 3 candidate moves, you have to put one foremost in your mind, and knight to g4 was the move that Anand chose, forcing the bishop back. This was also a time-gaining move. And now we get to choose, again, a candidate move for black in this particular position that we might want to follow up on our previous ideas and play just to be consistent. You want to follow a thread of ideas. And this process has to be done over and over and over again. If you don't do this process over and over again, it will fail you when you need it most, because you can't be thinking about, do I put my right foot in front of my left foot when I'm walking? No, you do this automatically. It's internalized. It's intrinsic in your well-being. That gives the most incredible players in the world the ability to play bullet chess. And because they have this ability to play bullet chess, everyone just thinks they're moving very quickly, very, very quickly. But no, they're actually playing chess very, very quickly. They're processing the candidate moves instantly. They're stockpiling all of their good moves so that they know those good moves can come up later, so that when they do get into time trouble, they will always have a stockpile of moves to draw upon when they need to move quickly. In this particular case, we started by putting pressure on this central e5 pawn 3 times. It is defended 3 times. So Anand's choice in this particular position was to move c5. c5 attempts to undermine the base of the pawn chain. Whenever you have a chain of pawns that are guarding each other in a nice Loctite formation diagonally, because they're all protecting each other, we would like to attack the base of the pawn formation. And when we attack the base of the pawn formation, should it fall, will weaken the head of the pawn chain, slowly but surely. Now, white, of course, makes use of the misplaced knight to knock it out of or away from the center. Playing knight to h6 is a relative no-brainer. We do not have time for the intermezzo of c takes d4. If we even considered c takes d4, queen takes d4, or knight takes d4 might even help white in many respects. But of course, knight takes d4 runs into d takes e5, and that would hit the knight again, and we would still not need to move our knight. So therefore, in this particular position, after c takes d4, queen takes d4, we will not be able to avoid losing a piece if we try to hit the queen with d takes e5, because queen takes d8 would force matters. They'd be taking a very valuable piece worth 9 pawns or more, and we would have to recapture because we can't actually let that one go, and they would be capturing our knight. So therefore, I'm going to be doing a lot of this analysis without actually moving the pieces because we need to work on our visualization skills as well. Therefore, the automatic retreat of the knight had to have been incorporated in our calculations with the attacking on the center with c5. So now white has to choose how to continue. And in this particular position, Beliavsky does not choose the best move. He has 3 things guarding this particular knight. This particular head pawn on the head of the pawn chain on e5, and he should just continue developing. This position is relatively equal chances for both sides. But Beliavsky follows another rule. There are 3 major advantages that we might be able to win a game with, like the 3 judges in American Idol. There is space, there is time, and there is material. If any one of them is against us, we will be okay as long as the 2 others are for us. But if we have both space and time against us, it doesn't matter. If we're up a little bit of material, we will be in a worse position. Therefore, Beliavsky chooses to grab space. And he's grabbing space in this particular instance because he can. And because it's a very natural reply by white in any case when a d pawn is attacked by a pawn on c5. Now we have a nice little outpost square here on c6, should it not be guarded by a knight at any given moment. And at the same time, though, black has a lead in development. Black is actually going to finish the opening in 3 moves, and the rooks will be connected. We just need to place a queen, a bishop, and a knight, and we will be in business. And white, on the other hand, still has to get his king out of the center, which involves moving the queen, and then in order to connect the rooks, we're going to have to move 2 further pieces, one of which was chased back. Now that may offset the fact this knight is rather poorly placed. So therefore, black continues by putting a little bit of pressure on that pawn, and when white prepares to castle, black might have to do some serious thoughts and considering. So we're going to do another set of candidate moves here for black. Let us consider what our options are in this position to finish the opening faster than our opponent. There are 3 phases to the game: the opening, the middle game, and the end game. And you're considering your options on winning at this moment the opening. The opening phase can be won, believe it or not, by not being up material, but by completing your development and having all of your pieces out and ready and active. There are also 3 questions that we have to ask ourselves. Where is our worst placed piece? Our worst placed piece might be holding us back. What is the opponent's big idea is the second question. And the third most important question is to pay attention to where are the weaknesses. In this particular case, if you haven't already noticed, there's a very serious weakness in the square on g3. And Anand chooses to improve one of his worst placed pieces. We're talking about the rook on a8 and the knight on h6. He chooses to improve his knight on h6 while tagging the weakness on g3, gaining time because the opponent does not wish for this knight to bother the rook and perhaps even sentence it to a relatively undesirable life on the h2 square. So therefore white has to take one more move out to defend the g3 square. Now notice that this was also a part of his plan of connecting his rooks through castling. He only has 2 moves left to complete his opening. And black at this moment, with the opponent's king in the center, by the way, decides to exchange pawns. And now, with the opponent's king in the center, we would like to open up the center in order to continue attacking the center. So therefore, the next most logical move, e6, falls right in line. Now notice that we don't know where this knight is going, and we don't necessarily know that we can't improve this bishop by then further attacking the pawn on d5. Now it's not in white's best interest to make any exchanges and allow the exchange of queens, But one might wonder, for the most part, about a move like d6, which gains even more space. This does look very, very awkward. However, black has a legitimate counterattack on the opponent's queen built in. He's got a legitimate counterattack on the center already built in. We have the move knight on b to d7, which threatens this pawn 2 times, and we're also threatening bishop takes f3, removing the defender of the d6 pawn, and it could be very precarious to try to hang on to this pawn if it went to d6. So as it turns out, Beliavsky, fully aware of the 3 major advantages in this position, space, time, and material, expedites his time by getting his king safe, castling. Absolutely. And black, of course, does need to break down the center. E takes d5. And white now needs to choose from several moves to finish his opening. And in fact, had he been aware of this really, really intrinsically important thing, and this is one of the reasons why Beliavsky perhaps was not a world champion, right? If you go through the games of the world champions, you're going to find invariably, even if you're going through Emanuel Lasker's games in the 1800s and the 1900s, they placed top stockfish line moves, and those top stockfish line moves are all based on the valid fundamental principles of good positional play. Therefore, in this particular example, the most logical move for white would be bishop d3, followed by potentially g4, or moving a rook to the open f file and putting pressure on the file as fast as humanly possible. Instead, Beliavsky plays a rather questionable move, knight takes d5. Now, he is moving the same piece twice. He does believe that there's nothing wrong with this, and it's possible that he only examined bishop takes d5, queen takes d5, queen takes d5, rook takes d5, which should indeed lead to a pleasant position for white. But being objective, being very, very objective, we have to realize that the opponent may not just take on d5, they may just complete and finish their opening. Now this knight sitting on d5, eyeing the f6 square with the help of the pawn on e5, looks like it may strip the king of his defenses. In fact, Elshan Muradi, grandmaster who taught in a camp with me many times back, often called the absence of this bishop an empty house. Basically, there are no defenses to the king if this bishop gets exchanged off. So therefore, Anand has to take into account the fact that should this knight come into this square, and we have to take it, if we should have to take it, we will be left with a little bit of an empty house situation. And this bishop will be ready to come in and fight for those squares as well. So therefore, Anand plays a rather solid move. He's trying to keep the knight out of d4, and we're once again going to go with candidate moves for black. How are we going to continue our thread of ideas, which we have started with the previous moves, with several candidate moves for black in this position? Remember, you're not looking for the best move. This takes a lot of pressure off when you don't have to look for the best move. Your goal is to look for all of the good moves in the position. And if you have Beliavsky or Anand's, depending on which side of the game you're looking at this from, if you have the move that Beliavsky or Anand played, or whatever grandmaster you're studying, in your move selection, I would consider that a great result. Whether or not you are particularly inclined to evaluate that move correctly and be able to dig in on the possibilities of why one particular move is better than others. In this particular case, Anand notices that this knight is only guarded by the queen. So Anand had several moves to choose from. He had bishop h6 with the help of the knight, pinpointing the weakness. After all, where are the weaknesses? The queen and the king are on that diagonal, and attacking it with the help of a bishop. And remember, this knight is guarding that bishop. That bishop would be guarded on that square. And on the other hand, we also have the weakness of this knight on d5 only being protected by the queen. and it is already attacked by bishop and a queen. So therefore we have two knights that can throw a wrench in the works on this particular knight on d4. We could play knight on f to d4, or we could play knight on c to d4. Now those are the three most likely candidate moves that any really strong player would consider and begin calculating. Now, for whatever reason, knight f d4 and knight on c to d4 are relatively equal in value. The knight will be cut off. White's reaction may well be the same. It is not a big deal. However, Anand believes that he can actually improve his opportunities by using the knight on c to d4 correctly. Now the bishop is in the game. The bishop is even threatening the knight on f3. Black has a very simple threat if this knight just retreats. If knight takes f3, b takes f3, and bishop takes f3. And that bishop sitting on f3 would be attacking two rooks in the form of a fork. Beliavsky, a strong player himself, knows that when something is there right in front of you, you do not have to capture it. He actually goes to the plan that we were mentioning before with knight f6 check. And of course, with this knight on d4 hanging, we have to follow through with bishop takes f6. And after c takes d4, once again, we have a series of candidate moves that we have to consider. Candidate moves for black in this position might include any one of a couple of different captures going after, let's say, the center or the king, or safeguarding our bishop, which is attacked by a pawn. So therefore, I'm not going to tell you where to place the dark squared bishop. Again, that has to be a part of your candidate move process. Remember, scoop up all the good moves, sift and sort like you are doing a trail of soot by the riverside in Gold Rush, California, and whatever remains should be the valuable, hopeful gold in the position. I often like to think of looking for the best move as looking for gold in the position. Now, Anand is fully aware of the empty house situation, so he does just retreat his bishop to g7. However, if you thought that black would throw in the move bishop takes f3 first, with the idea of bishop takes d1, should white go for the empty house theory with d takes e6? Absolutely equal. Bishop takes f3, though, will just be met by g takes f3, and we're going to have to resolve this situation in any event, so he retreats his bishop. White, therefore, grabs even more space. This is the second time white has played d5 to grab a space advantage, and this position is slightly in black's favor only because black has every piece, literally every piece, ready to spring into the game, while white is behind about a move and a half, which could be worth very close to at least half or 3/4 of a pawn. In this particular case, black chooses to try to start something, and we already know what he might need to do. Candidate moves for black in this position absolutely need to be sought out. Please look for all the good moves in the position, and when you have all the good moves in the position, only then might you start calculating these good moves for a logical conclusion. Now, and for purposes of our learning, we should not be going for, as Bent Larsen put it, Grandmaster Bent Larsen of Denmark once wrote, long analysis, wrong analysis. It is better to calculate a few moves deeper very accurately and with a good assessment than to calculate 20 moves with an unclear assessment and having a number of errors along the way. So in this particular case, Anand, amongst all of his moves, we have rook to c8 as a potential candidate move. We have queen to d7, attempting to come into the queenside to tackle this weakness on a2. And in this particular moment, we have to really consider a third possibility. We still have our previous good move of bishop h6. We also have the shifty move queen to e8, which looks as though it's eyeballing the e5 square, though it's defended twice. It is attacked potentially twice by a queen on e8. What we might get in the near future, the option of bishop takes f3. In this case, though, Anand went for a pawn to c4. This pawn is invulnerable. In fact, it is poisoned. If the bishop were to try to take it, black would win that bishop almost immediately with the help of a pin. You might think that that bishop can easily be protected by a pawn, but because of the pin being an absolute one to the king, it is illegal to move the bishop once it reaches on c4. The pawn on b6 will be moving to b5, and the bishop will be lost in return for a pawn. So therefore, we might be giving up an entire bishop in this position. So therefore, white's taking that bishop is off the cards. White needs to complete his development. He plays the lackluster bishop e2. We follow up with one of our candidate moves from the previous turn, rook to c8, and after king to b1, we follow up even further with yet another of our candidate moves from the previous turn. White defends his queen, and now after an exchange, we've diverted the queen to this possible square. We're now able to try to strike a capture in the center. Note that we can't take advantage of this pin in any event right away, and white begins the attack on the king side. Now this does lead to some very dangerous possibilities. We are trying to shove our pawn, they are trying to shove their pawn, and we have to consider all of our options once again with our candidate move process. Now we can throw more than one pawn at our opponent, or we could reorganize our defenses and perhaps even blockade the h4 pawn, or we could use a piece to stop the h4 pawn. But in any event, you have to consider what are the needs of the position, which are the best and worst placed pieces, and where are the weaknesses. What is the opponent's big idea? Obviously to attack our king side, so we might stop that with an automatic pawn blockade. So remember, you're looking for 3 really good moves in the position, or more, but try not to give yourself so many that you cannot calculate each of them in the space of time under 3 to 5 minutes. Grandmaster John Nunn, in his Secrets of Practical Chess, mentioned that if you think longer than 5 minutes in any position, chances are you're trying to make something work that is not either very logical or not very good. In this moment in time, it is true that Anand decides to shove that pawn forward into his opponent's king face. And therefore, white does have to deal with this. White should capture this pawn, and he does. And the rook arrives on c3, and white continues the important part of the plan. Candidate moves for black once again. I cannot stress it enough how interactive this process is. Every time you play through a game, you have to try to place yourself in the heat of that moment and consider what the players are considering at all times, and only by considering what the players are considering can you realistically, ideally, be able to take advantage of the situation when it does arise in your games. So we have several candidate moves that are possible. We do need to achieve more attackers on the king side. We do need to consider the possibility of white's attack on the king side. And we shouldn't take this task lightly at all. Now, the 3 best moves in this particular position are, amongst them, the idea of blockading with knight to g7. I'm sorry, not in this particular position. The idea of transferring the queen to the king side. I should have mentioned black's choices in the previous position after c3. One of them, instead of c3, was knight to g7, and another was queen to d7, shifting a queen toward the king side, or queen to e8, also trying to shift the queen into the king side. But here, however, what is our worst placed piece? Possibly the rook on f8. Can we really get it into the game soon? Not with the amount of force that is being leveled on our king just now. In any event, we may be able to capture back with the f-pawn, and this rook may well be in the game. So, Anand actually chose to bring his knight closer to the king side, closer to white's king on the queen side. Basically, either queen to d7 or b5 were also very realistic possibilities. We could have also tried to tag the unprotected bishop on e2 with rook e3. All those moves are good and relatively acceptable if you were to choose them. However, placing the knight here gains time on the rook. White does have to actually consider whether or not black's going to take this rook, which is not as valuable a piece as the knight on e3. Instead, white continues to a certain extent with his attack on the king side with knight to g5. Now things are starting to get a little grave. We have the e6 pawn push, we have the exchange, and of course if we exchange and we recapture with the h-pawn, there's nothing stopping a checkmate in 2 moves, with rook to h8 check, queen to h4 check, and queen to h7. So black does have to move relatively quickly in this particular case. He tries to ignore, but we will try to get to the heart of why he's going to ignore this, with queen to c7, and after the move knight takes h7, we are once again going through the candidate move process for black on whether or not Beliavsky managed to see our big idea with the move queen to c7 and the potential of all of the pieces coming in on the queen side or onto the weak squares around the king. Now, when I was looking at this game for the very first time, I considered only the possibilities of the weak squares rather than what is our worst placed piece. I also considered what is our opponent's big idea, and that vindicated my idea for the best move. Now, white did not have to allow what happened in this particular game, but he did. If you didn't see it already, if you've not considered it already, the move that was played by black in this particular position was rook to b3 check with forced mate in several moves. And on the introduction of rook to b3 check, Beliavsky saw exactly what was happening and resigned. Now, this game is indeed less than 30 moves long. It is the ideal length of time that you should take to be able to beat anyone who does not know how to play chess. You should make it your goal, your mission, your drive in every game when you're playing someone who is not rated very highly. In this particular case, 2640. You should be able to crush these opponents in 30 moves or less. Now, it is all about mindset, and I realize I am talking about a player higher rated than myself playing the white pieces. But when you think like you are better than you are, then your moves will slowly become better than your normal everyday moves. Now, in this particular case, if the rook were captured, even though Beliavsky resigned, the queen would enter the attack on the very, very weak square c2. And the thing on the follow-up that we may not have seen was the fact that we can capture the pawn on c3 with check after the move on b3 with check after the move queen c3, and it will be mate on the next move regardless of where the king moves, with the help of the bishop and with the help of the knight. So there's no avoiding checkmate on the following move. Now, I advise you to go through each one of these videos perhaps more than once. I do recommend that you could even go through them at 1.2 speed, just as well as our podcast, the French Bishop Chesscast, maintains allusions to very instructive tips that will help you. And for the most part, if you're listening, and if you're learning, and if you're thinking, you are improving. Thank you for entertaining this video on Beliavsky in one of Anand's earliest games in 1991 in Munich. Less than 30 moves, a brilliancy by Anand, the godfather of chess in India.